Hey guys, welcome to Unwrapped, bite-sized sex ed where we talk about all things sex, reproduction, puberty, and unsurprisingly, fertility. I'm your host Ava from The Experts. Today I'm going to be stepping through reproductive anatomy. Beyond where everything is, I will also be explaining the purpose of these organs, which if you didn't know, is to reproduce and have babies. And I get that you're probably thinking, well, this is a write-off. I learnt this in school, but did you really? I really want this podcast to teach you the ins and outs of reproductive anatomy, not the superficial, stock standard anatomy we all learnt in sex ed, which, for me and plenty others, was pretty shit. I promise to keep it simple, but I hope to give you all some information so you can have a better understanding of your own body. As a side note, it will be really helpful if you're listening to the other episodes on The Experts, which have a key focus on fertility and reproduction. So for today's episode, I'm going to cover both female reproductive organs and male reproductive organs. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to talk about inclusive language, because it's super important when we're talking about bodies, anatomy, and reproductive health. When we describe body parts like vaginas, penises, ovaries, or testicles, you might notice I'm not saying women's bodies or men's bodies. That's because not everyone who has ovaries identifies as a woman, and not everyone with a penis identifies as a man. People can be transgender, non-binary, or intersex, and their bodies and experiences are just as valid. In this series, I will be referring to people with ovaries as those with the female reproductive system, but I acknowledge that just because you have ovaries does not mean you identify as female. Similarly, I will refer to people with penises as those with male reproductive organs, but one does not always equal the other. This is to be respectful and helps everyone feel included and recognised in these conversations, which, let's be honest, haven't always been inclusive in the past. So let's get started. I'm going to begin today with the female reproductive system. This consists of the vulva, clitoris, urethra, vagina, ovaries, fallopian tubes, uterus, and cervix. If you're a visual learner, it might be helpful to look up a diagram of the female reproductive tract while I talk you through. Now, if you are completely unfamiliar with the physical structure of the female reproductive system, there is both internal and external parts to the female reproductive system. We'll begin with the external parts. You might hear people refer to this area as the vagina, but the correct term is the vulva. The vagina is just one piece of the puzzle. The vulva includes the labia majora and labia minora. These are the outer and inner lips of the vulva. The outer lips, or the labia majora, usually have hair after puberty and help shield against bacteria and irritation. The inner lips, or labia minora, can vary a lot in size, shape, and colour, and all variations are completely normal. They help direct urine and protect the vaginal opening. Next, we have the clitoris, which is a small organ positioned at the top of the labia minora and is packed with thousands of nerve endings, and its only job is pleasure. That's right. This organ actually doesn't have a reproductive function, just good feelings. Next, we have the urethra, or the urethral opening, which is where urine from your bladder exits the body in a small hole just below the clitoris. It's part of the urinary system, not the reproductive system, but is housed in the same general area. Finally, to round off the external parts of the vulva, we have the vaginal opening. This leads to the internal parts of the female reproductive system. It's where menstrual blood or a baby leaves the body. Now let's dive right into the internal parts of the female reproductive system. These include the ovaries, fallopian tubes, uterus, and cervix. To help us visualize what the internal parts look like and how they're connected, I want you to imagine a crucifix. I want you to imagine a person outstretched with both hands making a T-like shape. The two hands of this hypothetical person represent the two ovaries, one on the left and one on the right. The ovaries produce eggs, which are the female reproductive cell, which are sometimes called oocytes or gametes. They also produce female sex hormones. These eggs are required for pregnancy and reproduction. They remain in the ovaries where they mature and eventually become ovulated. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. We'll be covering the egg's journey in a later podcast, but for now, just know that the ovaries produce eggs. Moving along from the hands of our hypothetical crucifix to the arms, we have the fallopian tubes. The fallopian tubes connect the hands or ovaries to the body in this analogy. The fallopian tubes are thin, tube-like structures that serve to help the eggs within the ovary move towards the uterus. These tubes are lined with extremely fine hair-like structures called cilia, which pulse in a motion to push the egg through the tube. I have now mentioned the uterus a few times, and you may have guessed that it is the next structure in the female reproductive tract. Returning to our analogy, the uterus is the head and chest of our crucifix, connected to the arms or fallopian tubes, which we previously discussed, are then connected to the hands or the ovaries. The uterus is a multi-layered cavity that's primary purpose is to nourish and support the growth of a fetus. It is where a baby grows in a pregnancy. The environment of the uterus changes throughout a female's menstrual cycle, a topic that will be covered in its own podcast later on. These changes alter the makeup of the walls of the uterus to better allow eggs to stick to them and enable a pregnancy. If a pregnancy occurs, the uterus has the capacity to grow with the baby. Now, the uterus doesn't hang out all on its own. At the bottom of the uterus, we find the cervix. In our analogy of a crucifix, the cervix is the hips. It connects the uterus to the vagina and acts as a bit of a gatekeeper. It's a small, firm circular structure that stays mostly closed, but can open or dilate during childbirth or in response to different phases of the menstrual cycle. It also produces cervical mucus, which sounds kind of gross, but it's actually super important. This mucus changes texture and thickness depending on where you are in your cycle. Sometimes it helps sperm move up into the uterus, other times it acts like a sticky wall to keep them out. Last but definitely not least, in the internal parts of the female reproductive system is the vagina. In our analogy, the vagina is the legs of our person. This is a muscular, elastic canal that connects all of the internal parts of the female reproductive system to the vaginal opening. It is where a tampon or menstrual cup might be placed, where sexual penetration can occur, and where a baby passes through during birth. It has lots of jobs, and it's built to adapt, stretch, flex, and then return to its usual shape. At the bottom of the vagina, there is a vaginal opening, which we talked about when learning the external parts of the system. To connect that knowledge to our analogy, the vaginal opening is the feet of our crucifix. It is the bridge between the internal and external parts. Okay, that wraps up the female reproductive system. Let's now move on to the male reproductive anatomy. Similarly to the female reproductive system, some parts of the male reproductive organs are external and visible, while others are internal. Again, if you're a visual learner, look up a diagram of the male reproductive tract as I talk you through it. So, starting from the outside, we've got the penis, which is used for urination and ejaculation. Inside the penis is the urethra, which is a tube that carries both urine and semen out of the body, though never at the same time. A fun fact is that there's a whole system of muscles and valves that make sure those two things don't mix. Next, we have the scrotum, a pouch of skin that hangs outside of the body and holds the testicles or testes. It has the ability to keep the testes cool, literally. Its job is to keep your testes colder than the rest of your body. You're probably wondering, why is this? Well, as I just mentioned, the testes hang out, yeah, get it, in the scrotum. The testes have two big roles. The first is to make sperm, which are the reproductive cells that can fertilize an egg. The reason the testicles and the scrotum are outside the body at all is because the sperm that the testicles produce needs a slightly cooler temperature than the rest of the body. So the scrotum has this adaptive ability to move closer or farther away from the body to regulate temperature. The testicle's second role is to produce testosterone. We will discuss testosterone and all the other sex hormones related to reproductive function in a later video. For now, just know that testosterone is produced in the testes. Right behind each testicle is a coiled tube called the epididymis. This is where sperm go to mature and develop the ability to move and function properly. So that's it for the external parts of the male reproductive tract, which included the penis, testes or testicles, scrotum, and the epididymis. I will now talk about the internal components. First, we have the vas deferens, which is a long tube that carries sperm from the epididymis up into the body, where it meets up with fluids from the seminal vesicles and the prostate gland. The seminal vesicles are two small glands that sit behind the bladder, and their job is to produce a thick fluid that adds to the sperm and makes up most of the volume of semen. This fluid, which is made up of a type of sugar called fructose, gives sperm the energy they need to move towards the egg in the process of reproduction, a concept we will cover in depth later on. Next, we've got the prostate gland, which sits just below the bladder and wraps around part of the urethra. This gland adds another important fluid to the mix. Prostate fluid helps protect the sperm in reproduction from the more acidic environment of the vagina. Think of it like a little chemical shield that helps sperm survive long enough to do their job. The final part of the internal components of the male reproductive system is the urethra. As I said earlier, it is within the penis and serves to allow semen or urine out of the body. And that's all the parts of the male reproductive system. It is important to understand that while I've spoken about the female and male reproductive systems separately, some bodies don't always fit into these descriptions. Some people are born with differences in their anatomy, and that's called being intersex. If you're thinking, wait, what's intersex? That's totally okay. A lot of us weren't taught about this at all. So let's break it down. Intersex is a term used to describe people who are born with physical sex characteristics that don't fit typical definitions of male or female bodies. This might mean that physically, genetically, or hormonally, they have a mix of both female or male characteristics. Experts estimate that around 1 in 100 people are born with some kind of intersex trait. These traits can show up in a lot of different ways. Some people might have both ovarian and testicular tissue. Others have chromosomes that don't match their external reproductive anatomy. Some intersex traits are noticed at birth, while others don't become obvious until puberty, or even later in life. Not everyone fits neatly into the categories we are often taught, and that's okay. Being intersex is just one of the many natural variations of human biology. Alright, we've made it. We've talked through the female and male reproductive systems, piece by piece, function by function. We talked about ovaries, testicles, uteruses, sperm, eggs, penises, and I hope you're walking away not just knowing what's there, but what it does. And remember, this is just the beginning. Understanding our bodies is the foundation for understanding things like fertility, sexual health, birth control, puberty, periods, and so much more. If you're wondering what happens to the eggs after they leave the ovaries, how sperm meets the egg, or what the menstrual cycle is all about, don't worry, I've got you. That's all coming up in future episodes of Unwrapped. Make sure to check out the other episodes of Unwrapped and the other series with my fellow experts. You can find other series like What IVF Clinics Don't Tell You, Fertility Myths Debunked, Fertility and Aging, and Plastics and Fertility. Stay tuned for more Unwrapped on the experts.